I am here to introduce William Marra. He's the Associate Professor of Philosophy at Fordham University in New York. His education, PhD, is at the University of Detroit in 1949 with philosophy and mathematics. His MA was at Fordham University in 1951, and his PhD was also at Fordham in 1952. The books he has authored is Happiness and Christian Hope, a Philological Analysis, 1979. Pamphlet was Sex Education, the Basic Issues, with Dietrich von Hildebrand in 1969. His media background in radio since 1982. He has been a co-host with a talk show Where Catholics Meet, which is syndicated in 10 major markets, including WR in New York. And over the past 20 years, his appearances on talk shows in nearly 20 cities, and many debates and interviews on the social and economic issues of our times. His videos in the past 60 years has totaled many involvements in debates in New York, Detroit, San Francisco, and major cities throughout the U.S. and Canada. Also appearing with talk show hosts Barbara Walters, David Susskind, and Lou Gordon here in Detroit. He has had many in-depth interviews in New York and New Jersey Public TV. His lectures have amounted to nearly 800 appearances in 40 states, 6 Canadian provinces, England, Scotland, and Ireland. I think he's been everywhere. I would like to introduce Dr. William Marra.
Thank you, Richard. Father Robbo and dear friends in Christ, I'm very happy and honored to be speaking here. I knew Lyman Stebbins very well. In fact, it was at a Wanderer Forum in St. Paul, Minnesota, perhaps 20 years ago or 22 years ago, that he and I and Big Al Matt and Little Al Matt and a few other people talked up the idea of CUF, and I was always working with him, and for a long time I was vice president of the national organization. And I can't say enough words of praise for our dear Frank Teskey. He was a loyal, courageous, wonderful Catholic. And I think it's a tribute. It's such a wonderful thing that when he died, you people did not let the organization fall apart. He's a true inspiration to lay people everywhere. My topic is not necessarily a happy one today. It had been entitled One Thing on the Blue Flyer, and now in the program you've been given, it's called Heroic Catholics in a Corrupt Society. And some people accuse me of being a prophet of doom, but they're wrong, because a prophet merely says bad things will come. I'm telling you bad things have come. I am a journalist of doom. Here is my plan for the talk. I want to sketch the ideal situation with respect to individual Catholics who are born by every day. A new baby comes into this world and is baptized into the church. What would be the ideal situation when that child exists with respect to the church, the state of the church at that time, and with respect to the state of society? That word society means in general the people around us, but in the larger sense it also includes government, law, culture. So the main theme of this talk is you have an individual Catholic born into two communities, as it were, into the community of God, the church, baptized into the church, and born into a situation of culture, government, law, education, and so on. So my first point would be, what would be the ideal for that baby to be born into? What happens when things are right? You need a long memory to know that. I secondly want to contrast that ideal with the sorry reality of the last 30 years, but in effect it's been the sorry reality of hundreds of years. Things get worse and worse. And thirdly, and this is a message of hope perhaps, I want to outline the Roman Catholic's urgent, extraordinary task now. CUF cannot simply be understood or be a mere organization uttering platitudes. We have to do something. That does not mean we shoot heretics. It does not mean we have pickets and so on. But we have to understand the urgency of the task facing the laity today, and it has almost never been understood, even in the best of times. As I can show you, even now it is terribly misunderstood by people who are either not bright or not honorable and not honest. Now, the ideal would be that when a child is born of woman on this earth, it is born into a healthy church and into a state and society which has some sort of decency and health and intelligence and which will allow a humane life to be lived. We are on this planet for 60, 70, 80 years. No matter how good medicine gets, that's about the limit. And most of the time is turmoil. But it is the fortunate person who, when he's born, enters a healthy church and a healthy society. Now, what does that include? It includes, first of all, that truth be taught, revered, honored, respected. The truth about God and man. The truth about good and evil. This truth would be respected perfectly. The world, the community, the teachers would understand that they have been entrusted with a momentous task to enlighten young people coming into this world, to direct them toward truth. And above all, I'm speaking of religious truth, but I mean also ethical truth, true theories of the state, true theories of morality, of education and law. Secondly, in the ideal situation, goodness, genuine goodness, holiness would be praised, would be put forward as something attractive, not something belonging only to dowdy people who hate the world and who simply have this grim existence of bearing all sorts of grim realities. When you have a healthy society, goodness is celebrated. The saints are the heroines and heroes of our lives. This is when the church is healthy. This is when society is healthy. One celebrates goodness, one shows it to be attractive, and one has very many examples, including heroic examples of goodness, and even heroic holiness. Thirdly, beauty is honored and promulgated and celebrated. Men do not think the economic point of view is supreme. Whether they build a barn or a house, whether they're clothing themselves, whether they're decorating the house, they understand that we humans live not by bread alone. We are entitled, we are called to beautify the earth and beautify our surroundings, including our very clothes. We Catholics, above all, should be festive people. We should understand this adventure of being pilgrims for 70 or 80 years on earth in a redeemed world with Jesus Christ, true God and true man, leading our church, having redeemed us by the sacrifice of the cross. So, truth and beauty and goodness would be honored and exalted, and we would be surrounded by examples, and we would be encouraged to form ourselves according to these examples. Now, in such a world, is sin still possible? Of course it is. Our problem as fallen members, sons and daughters of Adam and Eve, is this: we come into this world gravely flawed. Our mind is darkened, as the Catechism used to know. Our will is weakened. So even when we know what is good, we resist it. We are fallen beings who need to be formed. We need all sorts of strength. We need to be made aware of the divine aid toward holiness, toward virtue, so that we can conform ourselves to God's holy will. So sin, unfortunately, is possible and is real. The just man sins 7 times a day, says the Scripture. So even in this world of truth and goodness and beauty being celebrated and encouraged, alas, we shall fall. Alas, some of us will have tragic moral circumstances in which our earthly happiness fights against the moral law, in which if we are to follow Christ, we sometimes have to say no to loved ones. Christ sometimes is a sign of contradiction between ourselves and our parents and our in-laws, as Jesus himself noted. Nevertheless, although sin is possible and real, it is never defended or glorified. That is the key to the Christian commonwealth, that truth dominates things. One understands that there are things which ought to be, which can be, which the will of God imposes upon us, weak beings that we are. We fall. But then in humility we ask repentance. We do not excuse ourselves by going to this or that favorite priest who will simply whitewash the whole thing with a workshop. This is the great thing, as my great teacher von Hildebrand noted. Immorality is a horrendous thing and offends God. But it is still not so bad as amorality. When one has an amoral society, that is the Greek letter A, meaning no. So a theist believes in God, an atheist does not believe in God. A society which has morality knows there is a moral code, but a society which is amoral rejects any notion of a moral code. Never mind immorality, they don't think there's anything to conform to. And this, if you want to know what does that mean, well, look around you. You're living in this amoral society. You can take the most unspeakable realities, and you'll find someone somewhere, usually a theologian, certainly a politician, not simply to justify it, but to celebrate it. The most shameful things now are simply elevated into a kind of new vision of things. So this is the grim reality. But in my ideal society, we understand what is good, what is true, what is beautiful. When we fall in humility, we ask to be cleansed and to be raised up, but we do not delude ourselves with this diabolical amorality. We do not construct a theory to conform to our low practice. When we fall, we understand we are low, and we look toward the truth and beg God to raise us toward it. So much then for this first ideal society. And the big point to note is, to the extent it has existed, to the extent it can exist, to that extent it does not demand heroism of the people living within it. My topic is the heroic Catholic in a corrupt society. Well, to the extent that the society is not corrupt, heroism is not required. And in a sense, it's a dream world. And you might say, well, isn't that terrible? I don't want things to be so favorable to me that I almost stumble into virtue naturally. You might think that it's a far greater adventure to always climb uphill and always to clutch higher and higher. I say, well, fine. If you have such heroic aspiration, you can really exercise them today. But you better know the bitter truth of history and scripture and literature and biography, that we humans are incredibly weak and cowardly. It takes a great effort to do something even mildly heroic, and what a great blessing of God it is that the social order is so arranged that we, like corrupted children or weak children or spoiled children, nevertheless by the borders of order, by the barriers against temptations and so on, we are spared these heartbreaking temptations. We'll still have enough. Even if we lived in the most beautiful country with the most wonderful truth and with the most exalted encouragement toward truth and virtue, we will have those moments of great moral decision which will test us. But at least we will not be tested beyond our means. So that's the first point, the ideal situation, which heroism, although always encouraged and demanded, is not required. The little people, the weak people, can somehow survive. They are clinging to the ark of Peter, and there are no sharks, or the sharks are kept away. by the social order, to mix a metaphor. Now, what's the reality? Well, one can start anywhere, and it is not accurate to say that everything fell apart in the aftermath of Vatican II. That's totally shallow history. It's not even fair to say that everything fell apart with Luther, although that's much more profound history. But in any case, wherever we go now, there are individual people with good ideals. There are always intelligent people, always people more or less educated. But the simple fact of the matter is, if you go back 50 years, 100 years, 150 years, in Western civilization, I'm talking about Europe. Hilaire Belloc at one time said, the faith is Europe and Europe is the faith. In a way, he identified the totality of Christianity with Europe, but that's not necessarily accurate. Nevertheless, the great flourishing of the faith has a real anchor in the great countries of Europe, France and Germany and Italy and Spain and England and Ireland. But what is the harsh reality, which has been noted by the perceptive popes of the last 150 years? The reality is this, that the state, the secular world, and the secular society has been lost to Christ. We have no Christendom. A lot of people applaud that. People say, fine, this is what the Enlightenment rhetoric is all about. Finally, science and learning and law are liberated from priestcraft. Finally, reason can dominate the entire human life. Oh, you can applaud it or not, but the fact is that. The fact is that the environment, the large environment in which a child grows up, has been lost to Christ. And you say, when did it really happen? Well, the more history we know, the more we can accurately pinpoint the different forces at work. But it's certainly absolutely true that for the last 200 years, Europe has been is seized by what people, the correct word for it is the revolution. It's not true to say we have a revolution here, a revolution there, a revolution there. We have the revolution, which came to a high point with the French Revolution, in which Christ was literally ousted, in which cathedrals were desecrated, in which the goddess Reason was enthroned on the high altar of Notre Dame in Paris, and in which the church lost all impact on society. And that was in France, oldest daughter of the church. In France, which today is a total disgrace, with a few honorable exceptions. One of the most corrupted societies in the world. So, the point is this, Christ has been lost, the state and society and all the institutions, or most of the institutions, have been lost to Christ, and dear friends, this includes the United States of America. This is a harsh truth which people, for various reasons, do not want to utter, do not want to hear. When they hear it, they do not want to understand it, because a mythology has been promulgated in this country, even by Catholics who are good, but they're naive, that this country and its social structures offers the most beautiful example in all history for the freedom of the church and the exaltation of the church. This is a great myth. And it is because this myth has blinded so many of us that we have acquiesced in this horror that is destroying the country and destroying the church. As if the Constitution was written by God, and so too the Declaration of Independence, and that no empire, no jurisdiction, no theory of government ever before had the right combination of freedom and separation and unity of church and state. I tell people that thanks to biblical criticism, we have these learned problems of whether God is the author of the Bible. Everyone's saying, well, we don't know if this is inspired or not. But everybody in this country seems to think that, well, maybe God didn't write the Bible, but He wrote the Constitution. And He wrote the Declaration of Independence. And it is considered unpatriotic to doubt that. Well, please note what I'm saying, whether you agree with it or not. I'm saying that America, despite its Protestant roots and somewhat Christian roots, has been lost. The state and society has been lost to Christ. It did not seem so for a while because of certain historical accidents. including the influx of new generations of Catholics from all the Catholic countries of Europe. So for a while, it seemed we had the best of both worlds, an economic prosperity, a political freedom, and a vigorous church. But the secular institutions have strangled us, and we are impotent. The church in America is almost totally impotent. And it's not an accident, and you can't blame it on a few conspirators in Vatican II. How does this being lost to Christ, how does it display itself? I say at first in this country, but above all in France. In France it's not even hidden. Since the French Revolution, there is an arrogant, hostile attitude of all institutions against the true Church of Christ. So you have all of these temptations to compromise with the devil. And also in Italy, you have arrogant revolutionaries who in the name of the Enlightenment would attack the church. In this country, in America, it was not so. In this country, we were always persuaded that the state had this beloved neutrality, and all the institutions were equal, even-handed, such that if we Catholics were vigorous enough, we could prosper with not one penalty from the state. But my point is, the abandonment of the Christian truth, of the Christian vision of life and death and good and evil, is seen in the first place in education at any level, in law, in entertainment, in medicine, in literature. So these are the things that I collectively call the society. I'm enlarging the word, but my big question is, there are young Catholics born into the church every day, and what do they, when they become alert, when they start to confront their fellow men in society, what do they say? Well, what is mediated to them comes from the educational institutions and so on. Law, literature, entertainment, and everything else. Now, the popes, there have been enormously gifted popes in the last 150 years. Well, today we're celebrating Our Lady of Victory and this great St. Pius V, the Dominican. And he understood what Christendom was all about. But relatively, within the last 150 years, the most intelligent thinking in the world has come from the popes. You'd never know it. I used to tell people in the military that if the United States government wants to keep something top secret, they should call it a papal encyclical. Nobody will read it. And that is in my day, we did read some of the encyclicals, but not with much understanding. I'm thinking of the great social encyclicals of Leo XIII and Pius XI. Now, the church has been battered and weakened, at least since the French Revolution. Let's not go back to Luther, which is 400 years ago. Let's go back 200 years ago. If you look at Europe, and indirectly at America, you would say the bride of Christ has been damaged and weakened. The bride of Christ lost its roots. It used to control education and art and law and everything else. The Spirit of Christ breathed on the institution, even though we sinners, we men born of women, would soil the garment of Christ. We knew that we at least had a guilty conscience about it. At least something higher than we indicted us. This was salutary. If you read Shakespeare, when he talks about all the corrupt kings, the Christian kings of England, all the horrible court politics, no matter what filthy plot was being perpetrated, the entire stage was under the Spirit of Christ. The characters would indict each other and say there's a higher judge. If you think even of Portia in The Merchant of Venice, lecturing Shylock on mercy and on divine justice. So that this whole sense was, we're always sinners, we'll always have sinners, but we were not allowed to have a good conscience. We were not allowed to go to a workshop to erase good and evil, truth and falsity. We simply looked at the ideal, and we knew we were sinners. What a blessed state of mind to live in the truth in that way. The church was battered and weakened, but it was alive. And the recent popes, starting from about 100 years ago, started calling for Catholic action. That is the most misunderstood movement in my lifetime. I have been educated by Catholics all my life in a time when the church was sane. I had wonderful sisters of charity for the first 8 grades, then the Jesuits for high school, college, graduate school. I've been with the Jesuit educators for 36 more years at Fordham, and very rarely do I ever meet anyone who understands what Catholic action is all about. There used to be, the correct definition, it's a very abstract definition, was the participation of the laity in the work of the hierarchy. It's a kind of general definition, but it's not so bad. Catholic action meant we, laity, had to do something in conformity with the will and the direction of the hierarchy. There was some wise guy, I think it's J.F. Powers, but I finally met the man 2 days ago and he said it was not he. He can't remember it was he. But it was a wise guy like J.F. Powers who wrote the book, The Prince of Darkness. He had a character say, Catholic action is the interference by the laity with the inactivity of the hierarchy. And that's kind of funny, because the hierarchy has rarely been energetic in many respects in any country. They're all humans. If you ever read St. Augustine's letters to bishops, he was a bishop himself and he used to tremble because his would be the more severe judgment. It's bad enough, as a Christian, he has to follow Christ. As a shepherd, he has to lead the flock to Christ, and it's a heavy responsibility, and by the time you get through reading his sermon, you wonder whether anyone is ever saved. That had been it's a very popular topic in theology. But hierarchies have all kinds of problems. I sympathize totally with what's happening, but they were not especially successful, at least put it this way, in having Catholic action. But the popes were saying this. The popes are saying we've lost all this terrain to Antichrist, to Masonry, to atheism, to the Enlightenment stupidity. You Catholic laity, you have to go out into your environment and you have to replant the flag of Christ. And you have to do it like to like. If you're a working man, you do it with your fellow working people. When they use filthy language, when they have all kinds of blasphemous speech, when they degrade women, you at least don't laugh. You might not preach, it might not be tactful to preach, but at least you do not acquiesce in this with your laughter or your embarrassed laughter. No, you resist it. People have to know you're a Catholic. And to the extent you're educated, to the extent you have any leadership ability, in whatever milieu you find yourself, your ambition is not simply to get along, to be accepted. Your ambition is to push the reign of Christ back into education, the marketplace, law, politics. I know I'm asking the impossible. Christ in politics? Well, you better know. That's one of the goals of Catholic action. You better know that in certain countries in Europe, Portugal during Salazar's day, Austria during Dollfuss, that was the ambition. You had great Catholic statesmen who understood some of the responsibilities of a Catholic in politics. In this country, most Catholics are a disgrace. The higher up they go, the more disgraceful they are in politics. And they always plead, well, I'm part of a pluralistic society and I can't impose things, as if I'm asking them to impose Mass on Jews. No Catholic politician has the right to force Jews to go to Mass. But you mean, as a Catholic, you cannot allow the light of Christ to guide you about pornography? About celebration of adultery and vicious sodomy? You mean you have to blind yourself, pluck out from your whole knowledge anything Christian so that you can rule with what guidance? Astrology. That's the only thing left to you when you pluck out your Catholic vision. And the Catholic politicians in this country are total disgrace with a few honorable exceptions. You would need a microscope to identify anything Catholic in most of the notoriously important, quote, Catholic politicians. And one can say the same of Supreme Court justices and professors and deans and doctors and lawyers and entertainers. We have allowed the entire world to be occupied by Antichrist, to the great detriment of virtue. You have to be a hero to survive in this sewer, which we have allowed to occur mostly by inaction. It's not that we will evil, but never having understood the demands of Catholic action, and perhaps not having the zeal or the gift to implement Catholic action, led by a hierarchy which did not understand Catholic action, least of all in America, for the most part. We had a few honorable exceptions, really gifted prelates. But for the most part, the prelates were so happy they were not persecuted for putting up a church building. They were so happy that the chief of police allowed them to park outside during church services. They had not a clue of the real meaning of Catholic action, of the real meaning of the role of the laity. Now the point is this. What we mean is this. Bishops and priests are part of the teaching church, the ruling church. They have a certain charism from God. And their problem is to mind the store. Their problem is religious truth. Their problem is the holy sacrifice. Their problem is to be this absolutely necessary mediator between a fallen humanity and God the Father. They are part of the priesthood of Christ, the ministerial priesthood of Christ, and they cannot be replaced. They are not supposed to be governors, or necessarily professors, or scientists, or artists, or radio personalities, or football stars, or doctors. That's our job. We laity, for whatever reason, have not embraced the priestly or religious vocation. We have the give and take of the marketplace, the university, the hospital, and so on. And it's not the problem of the bishop to go into a hospital and clean up the abortion. It's not the problem of the bishop to go into a university and clean up the stupidity, which is everywhere present. It's the problem of us laity. We're supposed to have been formed by the religious structure of the church, nourished by her sacrament, given this great vision and zeal of heaven and eternity, and armed thus. We're supposed to enter the secular world and do something tactfully, intelligently, prayerfully, humbly, but we're supposed to do something. That's what Catholic action should mean, used to mean, must mean. Never mind all this double talk of the post-Vatican II church. Now my point is, to the extent we allow Antichrist to run the world, and it's almost 99% complete in this country, to that extent it becomes harder and harder to be pious, to be pure, even to be honest. If you're in the typical business, you find out that you're always asked to make compromises about truth, about honesty. The only way to stay competitive is to lie a little, to fog over this or fog over that. So the person whose natural conscience tells him to do this or that, he's already forced to compromise unless he's a hero. It's extremely hard for anyone to be chaste in marriage in the modern society. And I'm not saying that you go lusting after other people, but part of chastity is no contraception. Now, you just take a noble Catholic couple formed by Christ, the husband trying to earn a living, the pressures which we have allowed Antichrist to build up, thanks to every sort of abomination in law and education and entertainment, those pressures are so bad, it's almost impossible for a young couple, unless they're truly heroic, to have some sort of a large family. I mean even more than 5 children. Because it's almost impossible that somehow or other the mother will have to work. And they have all these other bills and insurance and everything else. Once the children grow up, they surrender them to godless institutions. So, we can say that the point here was this: in the name of liberalism, pluralism, democracy, all of these stupid slogans of the French Revolution, but they had already been uttered by Luther, this whole attempt to escape truth, to escape the real limitations of reality in terms of God's law, God's truth. They call it liberalism, free thinking, name what you want. In this country we have all sorts of euphemisms for it, like democracy and pluralism. In the name of that, We have created a moral social sewer, a hellhole. We are assaulted from every sense, from every side, in every opportunity. We are assaulted with Antichrist. The few who can survive are the strong heroes who have been somehow formed, but one wonders how, by what grace, by what set of prayers, by what divine election were certain people formed. The rest of the people are swallowed up by the sewer. And the only thing our civilization says is, after enticing us into 101 different abominations, our civilization, when it finally recognizes that certain of these abominations have bad consequences, they say, well, just say no. They surround you with the most enticing filth. They surround you with the glorification of every impurity and every abomination. And then when they realize there's an AIDS epidemic, well, just say no. Dear friends, this whole problem that I broached at the start of the meaning of Christian social order is this. We humans, Catholic or not, are like frail plants. We are simply, when we germinate, we have a tender hair root. And the whole meaning of Catholic civilization is, by intelligent social structure, above all by the grace of God, by prayer, by this whole vertical dimension in our lives, we set down strong roots in the ground. And then when tides of sewerage try to overwhelm us, we stay rooted. We are young, tender, sapling oaks, but we're rooted. And when hurricanes come, we're rooted. But if the social conditions are such that those root hairs remain very fine, the first little splash of a rain will wash us away. So there are two dimensions to the individual and society. From the passive point of view, the ideal is young people, young Catholics above all, are encouraged and aided to grow strong roots, so that when hurricanes and waves and tidal waves of sewage come toward them, they'll stand erect. Secondly, that was passive, the ability to withstand the filth of Antichrist. When one comes to the active, one means this: when you are a young child, you can lift up perhaps a stone of 1 pound, and then it takes health and exercise and nutrition so that you can lift up increasingly larger obstacles. And to translate this to the moral sphere, we people are born with freedom, but the freedom has to be developed, strengthened, nourished. It has to be given supernatural and natural aid. It has to be encouraged when it is still fragile, so that finally we can remove obstacles. But when the entire social structure is such as to enfeeble our freedom, is such as to assault it when it is not yet strong, the minute we come to the slightest different problem, either we're swept away because our roots are not there, or when there's an obstacle in front of it, when we try to remove the obstacle, we find we're impotent. We have no power. We are flabby. And my main point has been, such has been the devastation of the last 200 years, accelerated beyond belief by the last 30 years, that most people now have no roots. Above all, the young, the tragic young, the defrauded generation from this great civilization of progress, they have no roots. Most people are so morally enfeebled, they are not able to remove the slightest obstacle, and therefore they are playthings of the wind. They are wards of the state. Every idea carries them this way or that way. And therefore, only heroes, only the most rigorously formed heroes, can act like real Christian Catholics in the marketplace, in the academy, in the family, in law. Law is still more sick than medicine. Medicine carried out the executions, but it's the lawyers who started it all, the justices. And theology is still more sick than law, because if they were not encouraged or tolerated by the Judas theologians, they would never have gotten this far. But we are in a moral sewer. Blood flows, filth flows, families fly apart, entertainment is unspeakable, Education is the most horrendous thing going. One wonders why all this money spent and all this wonderful congratulations about learning when one knows what's really going on, even in so-called Catholic universities and seminaries and so on. Now, and my point is that all we can say is just say no. After we have debilitated the human person, after we have pulled out any sort of root, and then when all of these things come, we simply say, well, just say no. You're asking for a miracle. There is no spiritual mass there to resist the hurricane. There are no spiritual sinews to lift up the obstacle. What do you mean, just say no? The whole world is telling us to say yes to every abomination. And we have nothing to say to the world but no. We'll put a bumper sticker up. We'll put a sign up, drug-free zone or something like that. And that's going to solve our problem. And it'll only cost us $50 million at the bargain. Now, the scariest thing is this. The popes of the last 200 years have understood that we lost the world to Christ, thanks to 100 different causes, some of them originating in the frailty and sinfulness of Catholics. We do not deny that. We've lost the world to Christ, but at least when Catholic action was proposed, we understood that it was the mission of us laity to try and push back the dikes, or hold up the dikes at least, so that Christ could somehow get reinstated into the different professions. And in my own lifetime, I am the perfect example of this line I'm about to draw. In my own lifetime, despite the fact that the church had an outward vigor, it was not very intelligent in its inside, but at least we knew. We had Catholic lawyers' guilds, Catholic doctors, Catholic nurses, and those brave people with a good chaplain at least knew they were expected to stand up when their confreres would propose something horrendous, and many of them, to their credit, did. But the most scary thing of the entire point I've been making today is this, that the church in the West, and I'm talking about Europe, and I'm talking about Canada, and I'm talking about America, and now South America, which has nothing original ever to say. It gets all the South American theologians speak German. The church in the West is almost dead. You hear all sorts of double talk, oh, the Spirit's guiding everything, and Christ promises His church will survive. Of course. But Christ promises His church will survive in America? Where's that in the Bible? Where's that in any church teaching? The church will survive even if we're down to the Pope and a few priests and a few laity. But the true bride of Christ, announcing with pride and glory the truth of Christ, the true bride of Christ giving an acceptable worship, that's going to survive. You better not take that for granted. In any given country, don't start taking that for granted, dear friend. Now, the scary thing is this. The collapse of the church in this country. I would say, if you ask me to perform a spiritual diagnosis, I say the heart is barely beating in America, and the heart is almost dead. I mean, it's still worse in France, Germany, and Italy. Italy is the latest casualty. It's a scandal of the first magnitude, what's happening in Italy. Whether with divorce, abortion, pornography, any unspeakable stuff, the Italians want to catch up to us. The French are ahead of us in all of this. Now, I say that the church, so long as it was in the fight, and so long as it knew it was in the fight, the church was a resistance to Antichrist. The church fought against it. But the more the church collapses from its own internal contradictions, the tidal wave engulfs us. 30 years ago, if you try to put a filthy movie in New York, Baby Doll, I hear it wasn't even that bad. Today it would be PG. They knew that the Archbishop of New York would speak, Cardinal Spellman, and 2 million Catholics in New York would at least would wake up. Today, so impotent is the church, they can take the most sacred mysteries of our religion, Jesus Christ, true God and true man, the most holy and spotless virgin. They will make unspeakably blasphemous films about it. We say nothing. In fact, our theologians go on talk shows praising us. Friends, if you need any other diagnosis about a dead church, I just gave it to you. So, We therefore say the collapse, the almost total collapse of the church, and this is only 30 years old. I saw it coming 40 years ago. And real people who knew history saw it coming 100 and 200 years ago. But the real collapse occurred upon the occasion of Vatican II. I do not say Vatican II caused it, but you better believe that it gave every heretic, every raving libertarian an excuse for pushing Antichrist, for destroying truth, for destroying faith, morals, and even the sense of beauty. There was a sense of class and decorum even 30 years ago. One spoke of one Sunday best at Mass. One did not want the church to look like a barn dance. One understood the momentous reality of the vertical dimension, that we, creatures of the all-powerful, thrice holy God, come to worship God. We've lost it all, with a few honorable exceptions. Now, we have a new clericalism, though. See, we have been told the laity have been flattered ad nauseum by the clergy who then resign. But while they still wear the robes of clergy, they flatter the laity ad nauseum that you are church. This is the age of the laity. But they are pushing the laity in their own favorite direction. And the more they get the laity corrupted, because they never speak about chastity, they never speak about the hard sins, what they do is make some reference to apartheid in South Africa. That's our biggest problem in America. The South African apartheid. Or the fact that we have sexist language in the liturgy or in the Bible. I mean, we have to have a new commission because so many women are in pain about that. Well, that's the heroic challenge of our preaching in the 20th century, in the last 30 years. Now, the new clericalism is to tell the laity that you're very important and that the new clericalism does not have a clue about real Catholic action, really restoring the world to Christ. What it wants is to make of the laity busybodies. And I want to just read something from a parish bulletin. The man who wrote it, or the woman who wrote it, is obviously in good faith, but is stupid. And this is from some parish in Seattle. I was out there recently. Over 22 years ago, the Second Vatican Council promulgated its decree on the laity. In this earth-shaking document, the fathers of the Church reminded us of some fundamental truths of our faith going all the way back to St. Paul. Specifically, they emphasized that by virtue of our baptism, we are exceedingly blessed and gifted. So far, so good. That's not really earth-shaking, though. And it's not really news. It should not have been news. Anyone who knew the Baltimore Catechism knew that. As men and women blessed and gifted, we are all called to share our God-given talents with the rest of the body of Christ. Beautiful. That's in the direction of Catholic action. Since each of us fits somewhere in that body, each of us is called to recognize our gifts and to share those gifts with others. No problem yet. In view of this teaching, now comes the earth-shaking consequence of this teaching. In view of this teaching, we at St. Mark's will soon be calling forth new men and women and will be conducting classes for them to be Eucharistic ministers and lectors. Busybodies. This is the church is in shambles. The society is totally in shambles. We get that the priests have not enough work to do. They're so busy arranging all things. When they are the distributors of Holy Communion, and the moment you allow anyone, ordained or not, to handle that sacred species, I don't say it's a sin. That's not a sin. And the moment you allow communion in hand, that's not a sin either. But in that moment, you're telling people it's common. It's just an ordinary thing. Instead of having all these barriers so that people ascend the steps of the city of God and with trembling hands understand what is at stake. Anybody can have the Blessed Sacrament. Anybody can give it out. And in my parish, it's a small parish, the church holds 130 people. At one time we had 80 extraordinary ministers. And these people were flattered by the bishop. You are church. Now you're doing this earth-shaking document of Vatican II. It's getting to you. You're finally doing what the church and God demanded of you. No, you're busybodies. You people work. You go to the supermarket. You're in school. You're lawyers. You're doctors. Are you doing one thing there? No. But you're all busybody. You got your surplice on and looking important. So this is the corruption of the laity, and I don't blame the laity. You have a new clericalism which hides its impotence, which hides its total misunderstanding of Vatican II and of church history and of church doctrine, and it's manipulating the laity into being flattered that we are church and we're important and so on and so on. Meanwhile, the congregation starves for a sermon on truth and on chastity and on real social justice. Meanwhile, the whole, there is not a peep about most things. They'll say a ritual thing against abortion once a year, but nothing else. Many of them are embarrassed by Joan Andrews and rescues. They just said, well, the Archbishop of St. Louis said, well, she has to obey the law. There's a real heroic witness to Christ. And this is the sickness of the church. Now, I want to finish, therefore, that the only persons able, that the sad truth, and we who are parents know this, we have children, we love the children. The only way these children will survive with any sort of sanity, I'm not even saying holiness, the only way they can somehow resist these tidal waves of filth, this cacophony of error and blasphemy, is for them to be heroic. Only heroes will raise a good family, will be able to enter a serious marriage. If you're merely the easygoing person, years ago when Christ had the fences, the barriers, the borders, years ago when truth was clearly preached, your weakness was compensated for by the stern judges around you in the courts and all that. So you might not have loved chastity, but you lived it. There is no help for you from anywhere around. So unless you are a person of steel, man or woman, young or old, you're not going to make it. You won't make it as a spouse. You're not going to make it as a doctor or a lawyer. You'll be totally corrupted. So the sad truth of the matter is, in this corrupt society, the Catholic laity uniquely are able to bring the leaven of Christ and the salt of Christ to the corrupt society, and that presupposes a healthy church, which we do not have. The church is a horrible cacophony of confusion. There is truth. The Pope utters it. There are still the valid sacraments, I don't doubt that. But there's utter anarchy in the ranks. Utter shameful actions in so many places high up. In so-called institutions of learning, from seminaries and graduate schools and universities right down to kindergarten. And therefore, the heroic people will survive. But to you heroic people, I don't care if it's you in person or your son or daughter or your grandchild, and this is what COP is all about, believe me, friends. COP has no reason to exist if it merely makes nice speeches and everybody goes home feeling good. It's good to be solidified, to have solidarity with each other, but what we have to is this: we have a new demand. Those few people, I don't care what your age, what your sex, what your education, the few people who are still not really bowed by the wind, by the hurricane, still not uprooted by tidal wave, still have some muscle left to lift up a stone, there is an urgent demand that we work. And this means a zeal for the important things in this world, and that we work at ourselves first. That was Lyman Stebbins' first insistence. He knew that we're all fallen people. He knew that we torment each other with our pettiness and our sinfulness. So he begged COP to have a deep spiritual formation. And that's a sine qua non. Without that, we don't go anywhere. It's not enough to picket and shoot heretics and all that. We need to be formed, and that takes work. And it takes self-sacrifice. We have to pray. And we have to have a ritual, we have to have a formalized way of entering into the prayer of the church, preferably with daily mass. We have to pay. We have to pay with our time when we could be spending it on more leisurely things. We have to pay with our money. We have to, with our little sixpence, try and put together some sort of a war chest for the inevitable expenses of any sort of a movement. We have to protect our children to the extent this is possible. You can have a nice ghetto, and for a little while the children are within the holy confines of your home with decent entertainment and so on, but if you open the door, the sewage comes in. If you turn on the television set, the sewage comes in. And there is no voice of protest outside. We're all told how wonderful freedom is and so on. So I briefly want to summarize and end quickly. The ideal was never realized, but it was approximated, and it was understood to be ideal in the years which we call Christendom, when the light of Christ dominated universities and hospitals and orphan asylums and governments and law and entertainment and painting and sculpture and music. This is Christendom. This was a time when Christ was acknowledged, even though fallen people fell by the wayside, but they knew they were sinners. And they heard sermons about good and evil, heaven and hell. For the last 200 years at least, I don't want to go further back, we have lost almost everything to Antichrist. The church, which at least was alive enough to resist it, called for Catholic action, had Vatican II not been stolen and vandalized, we might have had, this is what Pope John wanted, he wanted alert, intelligent laymen. He did not want to change one iota. He could not change one iota of faith or morals, but he wanted invigorated laymen with a kind of freedom to go into the marketplace and do something. Instead, the vandals stole it. The church has become more and more impotent. The church has lost its vision, with a few honorable exceptions. I mean the members of the church, the so-called leaders of the church. We've been workshopped to death by every sort of stupid person, and therefore society crumbles still quicker and quicker. A few things stand up, these lonely heroes and heroines of every age and occupation, man and woman, and my point is, you are the laity. It is urged and demanded of you in the name of Christ that you be the leaven, the salt, that you pay attention to your own household, that you try and get your own spiritual house in order, which is an enormous job, and then that you put away busybodiness. That's not your mission. Tell the priest to get active again. I was in the hospital almost dying. I had a bleeding artery, an aneurysm, and I didn't know what I was doing for a month, and I was very grateful that a Eucharistic minister gave me Holy Communion. I mean, if it was, I in no way attacked the person. I was very grateful, and I thanked the person. And in those days, I was not conscious of grievous sin. I hope I'm not conscious of grievous sin now either. But there were so many people in the hospital who had not seen a priest for 20 years. What a perfect classroom it would be if once a month at least some priest, instead of a Eucharistic minister, would go around, give Holy Communion, and then say, would you want to talk to me about something? Let's all unite, and let's all stand tall, because we have to stand tall for Christ. Our Lady, help of Christians, pray for us.